We hear a lot about Israel's tech scene and how this small destination of just 8 million has come so far with its thriving startup ecosystem, which many nations look up to and try to model. Google's Eric Schmidt recently said that Tel Aviv is second only to Silicon Valley. Today, our speaker is going to talk about how the relationship between Israel and Asia, a relation between Asia and Israel, and how Israel can change the face of China's economy from a tech standpoint. Philippe Metoudi is the managing partner at AlphaSec Advisors, founder of Duotem Capital Limited. He serves as senior advisor and executive board member of the Israel Asian Fund. He's also non-executive board member of various Israel companies. He also co-authored a book called Israel and China From Silk Road to Innovation Highway, which is available for sale near the bar. Everyone, let's give a warm welcome to Philippe.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. First, I'd like to apologize because although I've been living in English-speaking countries for pretty much my whole life, you will still have to put up with my French accent for the next 20 minutes. But I will try to improve during these 20 minutes. I'd like to start this talk by telling you a story that happened to me about 3 years ago. I was invited by a government official in Shanghai, whom I knew from my previous life, to talk about Israel. And he told me, he said, China is facing one of the biggest problems that you can imagine. And everybody who does business in China would relate to this. The cost of labor is increasing so fast that we're going to lose our competitive edge. And he basically wanted me to give him some ideas on how to built a model similar to what Taiwan and Korea did in the last 30 years and become more high tech and not focus too much on low value added products. So when I asked this gentleman who is very senior, I said, but why Israel? I mean, obviously he approached me because of my connection to Israel. And he said something that I will never forget. He said, because Israel is a smart country, and I was expecting something really big, he said, because they invented ICQ. And I'm sure like our generation remembers ICQ. And it's true that it was really the start of what was happening in Israel, because we're talking about two young guys who, out of a garage, built the first generation of Facebook, of WhatsApp, of WeChat, etc. And just for your information, the company had no revenue, and still they sold it to AOL for $400 million. So that was quite interesting for me, that the first thing that came to his mind was ICQ. I'm going to have three parts. I will try to go as fast as possible because I'm told that I cannot speak for more than 20 minutes. The first part, I'm going to give you a kind of historical overview because I think it's very important for us to understand that what is happening today actually started 1,000 years ago and not over the last 5 years or even the last 35 years since the establishment of diplomatic ties between Israel and China. The second part, I will try to explain why Israel has become over the last years a leading innovative center and ecosystem in the world. And the last part, which I think would be the most interesting for all of us, would be really the impact, what I call the disproportionate impact that Israel has or will have on the Chinese economy. Again, very, very short, and I think you will understand why I wanted to start with this. First, Israel is an Asian country. Although it plays in the European Cup, it's actually in Asian country. And you have the map of the old Israel, the kingdom of David and Solomon. And I'm sure many of you have visited Israel, and I'm sure that one of the things you went to see is the Western Wall, because the Western Wall is the last standing wall of the temples that was destroyed twice, in 586 BC and 70 BC as well. So what happened, and this is the second map, you had a very massive exodus of people from Israel who first went to Babylon, which is today Iraq, and later on they went to Central Asia, for example, what is today Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc., etc. And they were a very interesting events because very quickly, and we found track of Jewish presence in China as early as the 2nd century, and they were there as traders. And then you had two very big phenomena that happened that boost international trade. One is the Silk Road, which I will briefly discuss, and the second one was the colonial empire that really, as I said, boosted trades worldwide. Now, I love this map because this is really the One Belt, One Road that President Xi Jinping is talking about. And when I looked at what he was talking, and I said, well, you know, that's a great concept, but that's the Silk Road. And when President Xi Jinping is talking about building a road between Africa to Asia, to China in particular, obviously Africa is key because it has all the commodities that China needs. And there is no way, as you can see from the map, that you can actually have land transportation from Africa to China without going through Israel. I will tell you but a little bit more later, but something that is very interesting is that the major infrastructure work in Israel, whether it's ports, highways, tunnels, are all built by Chinese companies, and they are not there only to make money. So really they have a strategic goal in this. I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of the Jewish presence in Asia. Obviously, Hong Kong has been key. Everybody knows that Hong Kong and China have been terrific for the Jewish community. I'd like just to talk about Harbin, the city in northern China, because actually not too many people know the critical importance that Harbin had for the Jewish population. In 1896, when the Trans-Siberian was built from Manchuria, you had a very big influx of Russian Jews into Harbin. And those of you who have visited Harbin, you will see that it looks really more like a Russian city. Why is it important for Israel is the Russians, when they lived back home, were not able to discuss Zionism, you know, the concept of a Jewish state for the Jews. It was absolutely prohibited. But when they came to Harbin, they asked Chinese officials, they said, can we talk about this? Absolutely no problem. And actually a lot of the thinking of Zionism was actually developed in Harbin. Just for your information, we even had a former prime minister in Israel who was born in Harbin. I'm going to talk about, I mean, obviously I could spend hours talking about some of the key people here, but I just would like to talk about this Chinese gentleman, Mr. Jiaying Cheng, because he comes from the old Jewish community in Kaifeng. His name, because he used both names, besides Mr. Zhao, he used Moshe ben Avraham, and he was the governor of the province of Fujian. It was interesting, we found some of his notes, written notes, and guess what? He was writing his notes in Hebrew, although he was Chinese and working, you know, for the Chinese government, but still, he wrote some of his notes in Chinese, in Hebrew, sorry. Now, when we were thinking or trying to find out what really triggered this big Chinese influx into Israel, obviously, you know, I talked about ICQ, but as you know, Warren Buffett is someone who is very well respected in China. When you talk to private equity fund or venture capitals, they always talk about how great Warren Buffett is. And Warren Buffett took really the market by surprise because he invested pretty much overnight $4 billion in Israel. It was actually the largest investment at that time. Later on, and I will tell you a bit more, but as you probably know, the largest investor today in Israel is Li Ka-shing. But the investment of Warren Buffett really was a key factor behind the growth of Chinese investment in Israel. Now, all the people here, all these companies, have put their mouth where their money is because every company here has major offices or R&D center in Israel. I'm sure that if you have visited Israel and you go to northern Israel and you see this gigantic Intel or Motorola or Microsoft R&D centers, you really realize that there's something is happening. And by the way, most of the American companies, whether we're talking about Apple, IBM, or Microsoft, have made their first overseas acquisition in Israel. IBM is an interesting case. I will discuss this later, but it's interesting because they actually made the first investment in 1959, which is 11 years after the State of Israel was created, simply because Israel built the first computer. So they wanted to know why a country that was busy defending its borders, which is only 11 years old, how did they manage to build a computer? And IBM today, I mean, you will see IBM pretty much everywhere in Israel. Now, as far as why Israel has succeeded in high tech, and I can tell you that there are different factors which I'm happy to describe. The government has been very influential and has been key to the success of Israel. And I'm going to give you a few names. One is Ben-Gurion, the former prime minister, first prime minister of Israel, who said the future of Israel is going to be the south. And as you know, Israel is 2/3 of the country is desert. And agri-tech was actually key in Israel, and it was really his initiative. And if you look at one of the most prestigious universities in Beersheba in southern Israel, it's called Ben-Gurion University, and the expertise is really in high tech. Now, the other one, and I think that the bankers would actually relate to this even more, is Stanley Fischer. Stanley Fischer was the governor of Bank of Israel for 10 years. He relocated back to the US and is now number 2 of the Fed. But he was very, very keen to give major incentives for companies to build a very strong high-tech system. The other factors is really the osmosis between universities and business. I lecture at a university in Beijing, and basically every time I'm there, they want to understand what can be done to really integrate universities with business. The third factor could have been a major problem, but it turned out to be a massive opportunity. In 1990, after Mr. Gorbachev's perestroika and the Berlin Wall collapsed, Israel had to welcome 1 million immigrants. Now, you know, according to Chinese standards, 1 million is not that much, but at that time was 25% of the population of Israel. So Israel really had to build, you know, schools and housing to accommodate an influx of 25% of the people. Now, the good thing is these people who came from Russia were extremely well educated. They were chemists, which explain why Israel had 13 Nobel Prizes in chemistry, physicists, mathematicians. And one of the things that Israel had to do, and I will come back to this on the next slide, is really to build incubator to absorb these hundreds of thousands of well-educated people that we could not keep just doing, you know, basic job when we could really use their brain. The other factor, and frankly, I think we could have done without it, is the geopolitical situation. I don't have to tell you what situation, the geopolitical situation in Israel is. It's not that great, but obviously he gave a major incentive for Israeli companies to innovate and innovate very fast. Now, I was mentioning just before incubators. I'm not going to go through this list, but basically what incubators, and we started with 4 incubators in Israel that were like government-owned, and today you've got 29, actually the number has increased, 29 which are privately owned. For your information, the water incubator is owned by Hutchinson Whampoa. So all the technology related to water for the group is actually developed in Israel, but pretty much every sector of activity that you will find will be represented in these incubators. Now, the good thing that universities and the Office of the Chief Scientist in Israel get royalties, and some of the companies that actually started incubators are doing extremely well, and that makes some universities in Israel some of the wealthiest universities in the world. Now, the sectors that are interesting for the Chinese, and I will come really to a more Chinese aspect of my presentation, I would really think that still today, what really matters is water and agriculture. And I'm going to give you one example. About 3 months ago, we had the Deputy Premier, Ms. Liu Yandong, who was in Israel for a week. Now, when you see someone that powerful spending 1 full week in a country that has a population of less than half of Shenzhen, it makes you wonder what's going on there. And the focus of a trip was water, and I will come back to this, but China has clearly identified Israel as the solution for its growing water problem, and I will show you a couple of examples as well. Biotech, pharmaceuticals are key, and I will give you a couple of examples as well. and everything that is, IT related. Defense, we won't talk about it because obviously this is not something I want to come into. Now, historically, Israeli companies looked at the US for political, for historical reasons, and as of today, you have over 250 Israeli companies listed on the NASDAQ. This is the highest number of foreign companies listed in the US. Israeli companies are now starting to look at China, at Hong Kong, at Singapore to a certain extent, but the US, as far as listing, remains the key market. I just would like to take the example of Waze. I'm sure many of you have Waze on the iPhone, the interactive GPS, because that's a very interesting story. Li Ka-shing was one of the first investors. He invested $5 million. The company was initially sold to Facebook. The deal did not go through for one reason. Facebook insisted that the engineers would leave Israel to move to the Silicon Valley, and they all refused. So Google stepped in, and they said, we're going to pay the same price, which is $1.1 billion, and you guys can stay in Israel. So Mr. Lee actually made $150 million out of this transaction. And the great thing about this, he took this money and he's building a major campus in Shandong province, which is a joint campus operated by Tsinghua University in Beijing and Technion, which is the MIT University in Haifa. Now, I'm just going to, I'm okay? All right. I'm just going to take some minutes to just describe a few companies that will have a major impact on the Chinese economy. And I have to tell you that every company that I will show you here have either Chinese investors or Chinese strategic partners, because Israel has the concept that they cannot manufacture because it's too expensive, because it's a small country, but they want to develop and they want things to be built in China. Let me talk first about Netafim. Netafim is a world leader in irrigation, in drip irrigation. They have 55% of the market, and with a glass probably like this, you can pretty much irrigate a very large field by their own algorithm and their water drip. Now, China has expressed extremely strong interest in this technology. Netafim is doing a lot of work for China, and there are very, very big plans to develop their activity. As you probably know, there are only 7 companies that are FAA approved, so they can fly airplanes. One of them is Israel Aerospace, and unlike other airlines, they do not, any other aircraft companies, they have no issues with sharing the technology with other countries. So Israel Aerospace has a joint venture or strategic alliance with AVIC in China to build the next generation, initially of private jet and second jetliners. Bionexus is a company that will solve one of the big problems in China. It will reduce the delay out of the Chinese airports. I don't want to be too specific, but I just want to give you the overall concept. Stodart is a company that is partly owned by Roman Abramovich, the Russian billionaire and owner of the Chelsea Football Club, and a group of Chinese investors are actually the second largest investors. Now, Stodart worked, and it's a very interesting idea, and it comes back to what I was saying about the osmosis between universities and businesses. The team was actually working in Tel Aviv universities doing research on Alzheimer. And during a conversation with a battery guy, they said, it's very interesting because the way you describe what you're doing sounds very much like batteries operate. They decided to work to create this company called Stodart, and they have developed batteries that Samsung is not using, by the way, that can be charged in 30 seconds. So basically your phone would be able to be charged in 30 seconds. Interesting, but what is very interesting, they decided to diversify into fast charging batteries, car batteries. And obviously with the pollution of the big cities, it's becoming critical for China to move to electric. Now you have something called the range anxiety. You don't know if you're going to have enough juice if you drive an electric car. And the fact that you will be able to charge probably sometime next year your battery in less than 5 minutes, I think is going to solve the problem and give a big boost to electric cars in China. Now, the gas was very interesting because Israel had no commodities. And actually, this is one of the reasons why I think it did well in high tech. But a few years ago, they discovered the largest reserve of natural gas in the world even higher than Qatar. And Delek is actually working with Chinese companies to build pipelines straight from Israel into China to bring gas because there's too much gas for the domestic market. For example, Israel just signed a $15 billion contract with Jordan because they don't know what to do with all this gas. But China is definitely going to be a key partner. IDE, again, is something I would like to spend some time with because this picture, the one on the left-hand corner, is the largest water desalination company in China. It's in Tianjin. It took 2 years for Israel to build it. And one of the things about Israelis, and they're not always easy to deal with, but one of the things they're good at, when there's a crisis, they're very, very good. For example, as far as water, a few years ago, there was terrible shortage of water in Israel until they realized that the largest water desalination company in the world was Israeli, and Israel built actually 4 desalination plants. Today, Israel has too much water. So one of the contract they got was to build this desalination plant in Tianjin, and there are plans to build another 7 in China. Because what is interesting in China is the areas that lack water are all in the coastal areas. Inland, they have enough water, but it's all the Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou area. And these 7 plants will be built. I have to tell you that as of today, 2 Chinese companies are bidding to acquire ID in Israel. The pharmaceutical, I'm sure you're all aware that the largest generic company in the world is a company called Teva. It's an Israeli company. But they have definitely excelled in biotech and pharmaceutical. For example, for a country that is 70 years old, it has a life expectancy higher than the US and higher than the European Union. So I took 3 examples. The first one is Oramed. I hope that nobody here is diabetes, but one of the things that unfortunately you have to go through when you're diabetes is to have insulin shot. Oramed, which is listed on the NASDAQ, by the way, has developed a pill. So instead of getting a shot, you will just have a pill. And one of the Chinese companies is a key shareholder because they unfortunately expect the number of people with diabetes in China to go up dramatically. IceCure is also, funny enough, the largest shareholder of IceCure is a Hong Kong businessman. And IceCure, and I'm not going to give you details, but IceCure will definitely eradicate breast cancer. Okay, so their practice has been FDA approved. Polipid is also very, very attractive because they have built a molecule that mixed or combined with any drug will have much better effect. Again, one of the key shareholders is the Shanghai company. The urban aeronautics is just to show you how sexy some investments can be. This is a helicopter without rotors that China would like to acquire. We have some issues because it has some military application. But again, just to let you know that you have so many Chinese companies that are looking to make these investments, what we call these strategic investments, meaning to bring the technology back into China. All the companies I showed you, as I said, have the goals, either they're already doing business in China or the goals to bring the technology into China. Let's be a bit more specific about China, and all these names have actually made massive investments in Israel, but more interesting is every name here as an R&D center. I'd like to give you 2 examples because they were very large deals. The first one is Guanmin, Bright Food in China, that acquired Tnuva. Tnuva is really the Nestle of the dairy farm for Israel. Like everybody uses, Tnuva products. And we were actually quite close to the deal. They bought it for 2 reasons. One is technology. How can you keep milk and butter fresh for 3 months instead of 2 weeks? But also there was a hidden reason, which I'm happy to share. As you know, there are discussions of free trade agreements between Israel and China. And it's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to happen in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, but it's definitely going to happen. That will make Israel the only country in the world that will have free trade agreement with China, with the EU, and with the US. So Guanmin, Bright Food, is also hoping to use their Israeli entity to penetrate the US market. The other one was an acquisition by China Chem, which acquired a company called Marteshim Agam that is the world's largest company in fertilizer. And again, it's really to use this technology into China. The case of Li Ka-shing, again, is quite unique because we talk about it in the book. We think, and unfortunately I was not able to interview him, but we think that he's really in love with Israel and his technology. Today, he's got more investments in Israel than he has in the US or in the UK. And his team in Israel, Horizon Ventures, is extremely active. They review about 50 companies per week. And definitely, if you look at their investment, they are looking at pretty much everything. Fosun in Chinese, has acquired quite a number of companies in Israel. Sometimes we think they make a lot of sense. They bought a few laser companies, and sometimes we don't understand initially why they did it. They bought Ahava. Ahava, if you have been to Israel, these are the Dead Sea products. Now, I talked to the guy from Fosun. I said, why did you buy Ahava? And he said, yes, because we also bought Club Med, and we want to distribute Ahava products in all the Club Med entities in the world. So everything that these investors are doing, they have a very strong reason to do it. The other player that you should definitely follow is really Alibaba. Jack Ma felt a little bit left behind because he didn't do anything and he could see all the Chinese companies going back and forth to Israel. So he sent a team of 15 people with one goal: find me one company. That was this was the instruction. And actually, they found a great company called Visual Lead that is really included in their platform. Now, I will go through very quickly, but China is not the only ones. I'm just going to talk about Asian countries. But Singapore has always been involved with what's happening in Israel for strategic reasons that we can all understand. Something happened also in India when Prime Minister Modi came to office. He had identified before being elected that Israel would be a key partner. And if you see what Tata and Reliance are doing in Israel, it really gives you a lot of confidence that there is very big strength of investments, not only behind China, but behind other countries. I'm sure many of you have Viber. Viber was an Israeli firm that was acquired by Rakuten. And the Japanese actually were the first Asian investor because they followed what American investors did. When they saw all American companies going, the Japanese decided that they had to be very present in Israel. And the last one is Korea. Korea, what is interesting is all the car companies, the technology of all car companies, actually some of the high tech in the car industry is all developed in Israel. Now, something that I wanted to tell you as well, what is interesting is today, I would imagine that 90% of the mainland Chinese visiting Israel are there from business. And it's actually quite overwhelming when you leave Israel to see the number of Chinese business people leaving the country and arriving in the country. But when we wrote the book, we actually talked to quite a number of people in China, and we believe that the number of Christians in China is pretty much between 60 and 100 million dollars. 100 million people. Not all can afford going to the Holy Land, but they all want to go. And I think we were discussing this about Korea. One of the most profitable routes of Korean Airlines has been the Seoul-Tel Aviv, and it's mostly Christian pilgrims. So we expect a very large influx of Chinese tourists into Israel. So did I do okay time-wise? Okay. I am obviously happy to take any questions, but I'd like to thank you for the time you have given me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I think it's certainly been an eye-opener for myself and perhaps for other people here. It seems that Israel is very much focused on building relations in the tech industry with Asia. Is it specifically focusing on Asia, or are you focusing on Asia because that was the focus of your book?
The investment focus has changed. Back in the old days, Israeli companies, as I mentioned earlier, were only obsessed with America, with the American market, because it was mature. Today, we are approached by Israeli companies, and they want a Chinese partner. They tell us, find us a Chinese investor. And it's basically based on the concept of we create and China is going to manufacture. I'm going to show you just one example that I actually happen to have in my wallet, and this is a good example. This is a disposable battery, phone batteries, developed in Israel but manufactured in China. So when you talk to Israeli companies today, they actually think of China first. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but first because they know that the market is opening in China, that China has this incredible manufacturing capability, still at a cheaper cost. So today, the shift has gone from America, from the US to Asia and China in particular.
Thank you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious to know what the investment environment is like in terms of public opinion around Chinese investment in Israel, because we know that's been an issue for Chinese investors elsewhere.
What do you mean by environment? I want to make sure I understand your question.
The media coverage, the public opinion
Okay.
about Chinese investors.
Okay, actually this is a very interesting question because a lot of the Israeli companies are acquired by state-owned enterprises, but they usually use private equity firms as a middleman because initially they don't want people to know that a state-owned enterprise is investing in this and this technology. Now, it's very difficult, as I mentioned earlier, because when writing the book, we tried to interview Fosun, we tried to interview Li Ka-shing, we tried to interview Alibaba. They are all quite reluctant to be open about these investments. And give me two reasons. One, because they want to be discreet, and two, because they also want to make sure that their commitment to Israel does not affect their business in other Middle East countries. So I think this was one of the reasons. But, for example, Hainan Airlines has now decided to open a daily flight between Beijing and Tel Aviv. Cathay Pacific, and I travel to Israel pretty much every month. I've been asking Cathay to fly to Israel. They will actually start flying next year. And when I was asking them back in the old days, they were very candid. They said, sorry, we can't because we do too much business in other places and we feel that it might affect our business. I think it's wrong, by the way, because all these technologies, by the way, that you saw here is widely available in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Qatar. The security systems of most airports in the Middle East were built by NICE, an Israeli company.
We just had a few minutes discussion because the common question I get or assignments that I get is how Hong Kong's startup scene can become more like, will it ever be rival to Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv? And Philippe said no chance. So what can we do?
No.
So what can we do to improve the startup ecosystem?
Okay. You put me on the spot. Okay, disclaimer, Hong Kong is my home. I've been here 30 years. My kids were born here, so this is my home. But it's going to be difficult because, thank God, we don't have a tough geopolitical situation here. Okay, we don't have to worry about the guys next door, trying to hurt us. There are two things that are lacking, I think, in Hong Kong. First is obviously the mix of engineers. If you visit some of these companies in Israel, you will have American engineers, you'll have British engineers, you'll have South Africans, you'll have Russians, you'll have French, you have a real mix. So everybody comes with a different approach, which is in Hong Kong, obviously, I would imagine that most of people would be either from the mainland or from Hong Kong. So they would come from the same box. Two, I think a lot of people would be reluctant to be in Hong Kong, and let me try to be politically correct, but due to the proximity of China. But definitely what Hong Kong is doing, for example, with the universities, with building incubators, has definitely followed the Israeli model. Our chief executive was in Israel, I think about less than a year ago. He was there with a major business delegation. And one of the things he wanted to understand was really the universities and the incubators, because as I said, this is definitely the cement to build a very strong ecosystem. But Hong Kong is doing great. It can do better. Catching up with Israel and the Silicon Valley, I think it's going to be tough.
And so what specifically would you recommend in terms of, UST has an outstanding engineering program. but the finance department and the engineering are completely different silos. So what advice do you have to change that?
What is the percentage of foreign students at UST?
16.
16%. 1/6. Okay, if you go to Haifa and Technion, you would actually see that there's a very high percentage of non-Israeli students, Italian, American, South African. I was just saying this, giving this example. When I was visiting campuses back in the old days for my kids, we went to Stanford, and I asked the guy who was showing us around, I said, who is your major competitor? And I was expecting him to say MIT. And he said, no, it's Technion because we're competing for the same students. So I think getting more foreign students, building bridges with universities. You know, for example, when Bloomberg, one of the last things he did when he was mayor of New York, he wanted to have a project to build a Silicon Valley in upstate New York. And there was a request for proposal that went to hundreds of thousands of universities. And the winning bid was a joint bid between Technion and Cornell. So definitely, if you could, and I'm happy, by the way, to make introduction if you don't know any Israeli universities. I think we have Mr. Nagar, who is very close to Tel Aviv University. He can also make the connection. But definitely talking to these universities, having a better understanding of how they work, how incubators and universities have this just perfect osmosis would definitely help.
My question is about the politics of China. In all these collaborations, in your business considerations, how much does the politics of China factor into the issues? The lack of transparency,
Okay.
the precariousness of policy change, succession issues, and all those.
Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with what you said. But no, because you will understand where I'm coming from. The Chinese bought the airport in Toulouse. You know, Toulouse is the head office of Airbus. Believe it or not, it was discussed at length at the French Parliament. Do we want China to operate a major airport in France? When Dongfeng saved, not invested, saved Peugeot, it was also discussed at the French Parliament. A lot of countries are very reluctant to get, you know, Chinese investors, which is not the case at all in Israel, because with the exception of military companies, China can own 100% of any Israeli companies. They can be chairman, CEO, it doesn't matter whatsoever. Now, the political will, to come back to your question. I was waiting for clients, Israeli clients in China, and when they landed, they told me about half of the business class was Knesset members, the parliament member of Israel. So I think that what's happening on the political level is much bigger than what we can think. Now, there are two aspects. There is the political aspect, and to be fair, China has mostly been pro-Palestinians. For example, the most recent, what I call outrageous decision by UNESCO was voted by China. But as far as the economy, the politics are almost irrelevant. And you see a lot of high-level discussions between the Israeli and the Chinese governments to actually make things even bigger. Because I think what I've tried to show you is just the beginning. I think if I'm invited, if you still think that I'm worth your invitation in 5 years, I can guarantee that all the numbers I showed you will be much higher, because there's a very strong political will on both sides.
I'd like to ask, you mentioned about state ownership. Actually, how many % of these so-called startup technology companies are state-owned? Or in general, what is the shareholding of
You
all
mean
these companies?
Chinese state-owned companies?
I mean, in
Yes.
Israel.
Okay, let me tell you, Chinese investors are not very keen to invest in early-stage company. And it's
I'm sorry, not the Chinese state, Israeli government state.
pretty much over the last 30 years, Israel has privatized pretty much whatever it had. The banks, for example, were good examples. The banks, Bank Hapoalim, Bank Leumi, were state-owned, and today they're totally private. So there's very little private or public ownership of Israeli companies.
Okay, just one last collateral question. How does America see Israeli have been so actively exporting technology to China? And unavoidably, a lot of them can be defense related.
Let me tell you. One, I think I was expecting this question. saying that America would be ecstatic about what's happening between China and Israel would be slightly irrelevant, inaccurate. A lot of investments have attracted some US interest, i.e. for cyber technology. Cyber technology, as you know, is defensive, but it's also offensive. So I can tell you some of the deals did not go through, somehow because Israel was not willing to antagonize this very strong ally that the US has been. So it's definitely an issue. But as I say, military, we cannot talk about it because it's not something that is happening.
Okay, that's all we have for today. Thank you very much, Philippe, for this
Thank you very much.
insightful talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Nanhee In, your host for the day. Thank you.